Over the past few years, it's become increasingly apparent that ArenaNet has been gradually shifting studio resources away from Guild Wars 2 toward an unannounced mystery project. Despite renewed efforts to maintain a consistent content schedule for the game, recent mini-expansions have relied heavily on reused assets and really struggled to engage players. Interestingly though, job postings for developers experienced with Unreal Engine have been appearing on the studio's job board since around late 2021. This is particularly notable because Guild Wars 2 runs on a custom engine, heavily modified from the original Guild Wars campaigns, so these listings are almost certainly related to a brand new game. For the most part, these job postings were relatively uninteresting for most Guild Wars fans, I think. That is, until a now infamous NCSoft shareholders meeting earlier this year, during which it was let slip that Guild Wars 3 had apparently begun development. The announcement itself kind of felt like a clumsy attempt to appease frustrated shareholders, possibly concerned about the company's future, and while NCSoft has since downplayed the misstep, it aligns with several notable changes observed at ArenaNet over the last few years. For example, key developers including Alex Kane, a former narrative lead for Raids, Fractals, and parts of End of Dragons and the Icebrood saga, as well as longtime team member Matthew Medina, have quietly transitioned from Guild Wars 2 to an unannounced AAA project. Medina in particular is a pretty critical figure in the Guild Wars franchise, being an instrumental part of shaping the early drafts for the continent of Tyria, as well as creating the game's translatable alphabets. Their expertise is deeply tied to the story and lore of the series, and would seemingly be pretty vital to the future of Guild Wars 2 if it was going to be a long-term project for the studio. In addition to reallocating existing talent, ArenaNet has also embarked on a significant hiring spree, bringing in new senior staff members such as an art director, senior production director, senior cinematics engineer, senior global brand manager, and senior engineering manager, all again seemingly dedicated to this unannounced project. Whether this new project is Guild Wars 3 as we might imagine remains uncertain, but I think it says a lot that ArenaNet, when commenting on the rumors of Guild Wars 3, refused to explicitly deny its existence. They mentioned that as an active game developer, they're always looking for new projects, and there is a precedent for this, even at ArenaNet, despite them only ever releasing titles related to Guild Wars. We know that ArenaNet also previously worked on a mobile game around 2015, as well as more recently a project set in the Dune universe, codenamed Project Arrakis, that was using Unreal Engine 4. That project was reportedly cancelled around the time of the significant studio layoffs back in 2019, which resulted in 143 employees losing their positions at ArenaNet. In the aftermath of these setbacks, it's plausible that NCSoft and ArenaNet began considering the possibility of a Guild Wars 3, given that the Guild Wars franchise is both ArenaNet's most successful and recognizable property. Interestingly, Colin Johansson, the former game director of Guild Wars 2 and a central leader of its original development and direction, returned to ArenaNet in September 2020, not too long after these layoffs and restructuring. Now, despite all this, many Guild Wars 2 fans remain pretty skeptical that the mystery project is, in fact, Guild Wars 3, aka a new MMO set in the Guild Wars universe. From what I can tell, the skepticism stems from a mix of concerns. Frustration over the possibility of Guild Wars 2 being abandoned, which I do understand. Fears that the new project might turn out to be a mobile cash grab given the spotty history of NCSoft. Or just simple doubts that the game is an MMO at all, with many speculating that it could be another major departure, akin to the shift from Guild Wars 1 to Guild Wars 2. You know, maybe Guild Wars 3 is not an MMO, but maybe a AAA single-player RPG. There really is so much up in the air in regards to this unannounced project, but over the last few weeks I've been doing a little bit of research to try and dig up as many little tidbits of information about this project as I possibly can by dissecting job listings and analyzing information that's uploaded to sites like LinkedIn from ArenaNet and many of their employees. But to respect the personal privacy of some of these individuals, I'm going to try to keep some of the specific sources private. If you're curious enough and you really want to know, much of this information is publicly accessible if you're willing to put in the effort to find it. But let's start with the job listings themselves because they're actually remarkably transparent and probably one of the more reliable sources we can get our hands on. The first thing that's mentioned in pretty much every job listing that I've taken a look at so far is that it's a AAA game. But what exactly does that really mean? Well, AAA games tend to have a higher budget allocated for development, marketing, and distribution, a large development team, high production value, and generally target mass appeal. To me, this is immediately pretty exciting that they're calling it a AAA game because it's been a long time since ArenaNet have seemingly had license or the budget to put their entire creative force behind a project, at least one that's related to Guild Wars that has actually become public. Sometimes I look back at the early days of Guild Wars 2 around launch and kind of jealously look back at the game and the obvious resources and budget that the game had at the time. However, with the recent hiring spree, it seems like the studio has recovered somewhat from the 2019 layoffs and has returned to a size comparable to that of the original launch of the game, Guild Wars 2 that is, which was around 300 employees. According to LinkedIn, the studio is somewhere around 350 at the moment. Unfortunately, one of the other key features of a AAA game, whether we like it or not, is a long development timeline. Based off the hiring trends going after department-leading individuals, we can assume that whatever this project is, it's either in pre-production or early production stages, meaning we likely have a bit of a wait on our hands before we know more. As I mentioned before, we know that the game is currently being developed in Unreal Engine 5.4, but there's a lot of reasons why switching to an engine like Unreal makes a lot of sense for a next-generation AAA game, especially if it happens to be an MMORPG. At its core, Unreal Engine is a pre-built set of tools that more or less work out of the box. Now, this doesn't mean that customization of the engine won't happen. In fact, there's a lot of interesting custom features that seem to be being added to the project as we speak. But when you consider the amount of complexity that an MMO has, using an engine that has built-in tools that just work can save a lot of time and money in the development process. Time and money that can then be reallocated to other areas. Using Unreal Engine not only is relatively easy and cost-effective, but it's quickly becoming a standard in AAA game development, with titles like Fortnite and Lost Ark being developed using the engine. Because of this popularity, the technology involved in Unreal Engine is somewhat future-proof as well, because the engine is designed to evolve. It receives regular updates and tries to anticipate future trends supporting VR and AI tech. Future-proofing is, in my opinion, one of the most critical parts of creating a good MMO, and Unreal Engine as an engine might be one of those crucial technologies that allow games to have longer lifespans before becoming critically outdated or unworkable. Another interesting feature of Unreal Engine that I think is absolutely vital for the next iteration of Guild Wars, especially if it's an MMO format, is cross-platform and console support. A successful next-generation MMO has to be playable on as many platforms as possible. This is something that I think Guild Wars 2 really missed out on at the time of its release and ended up being a pretty big oversight. We can also gather from job listings related to art and animation that this game will have action combat, semi-stylized graphics, which I believe is pretty representative of the sort of style we see in Guild Wars 2, and a character creation system for both human and non-human characters. The listing for art director, which has since been filled, also originally requested individuals experienced in online multiplayer games and/or games as a service model games. But some of the most interesting information about this new project, in my opinion at least, comes from the senior engine programmer. This individual has been working on Unreal Engine 5 development at ArenaNet's since spring of 2021. The thing that stands out most here is that this dev has been working on a lot of procedural systems development. Now, I don't know all that much about game development, but this is one of the most exciting pieces of new information for me because it reminds me of the old days of ArenaNet, around the time of the development of Guild Wars 2, where the company was all about innovation and driving the MMO genre forward into the modern era. Procedural generation and AI tools, for better or worse, are some of the exciting new technologies that have the potential to drastically change the way massive digital worlds are developed and designed. To me, a next-generation MMO would definitely be leveraging systems like these in some capacity. And I think ArenaNet, despite some of their failures, did succeed at innovating overall. Their commitment to carrying this forward with their new project is incredibly encouraging to me, and it gives me confidence that the game is being carefully planned and that the team is really aiming for something ambitious. There's just so many ways that this technology could be utilized. To me, it sounds like the world-building technology team suggests that they may be using procedural generation to assist in creating massive, likely borderless, no loading screens, play spaces on a truly large scale. The scale of Guild Wars 2 has both visually and technically always held the game back, in my opinion. Some of this is probably the fault of mounts, but that's another topic altogether. There are also a lot of old school visual tricks that they used to make the world look grander than it actually is that really don't hold up in the way they might have in the past. This doesn't mean we should expect truly randomly generated scenes, but I think it can be very helpful when populating large play spaces. Not having to place individual blades of grass or trees by hand can save a lot of time and resources. But also imagine the possibilities this technology could have for current Guild Wars 2 systems like fractals. Randomly generated roguelike game modes have become increasingly prevalent in MMOs and other games, and I think the potential for a new iteration of Fractals of the Mists that are fresh and exciting is really there. The possibilities for these technologies are pretty vast and could be applied in numerous exciting ways. That said, this is a lot of what we can infer from the internet about ArenaNet's new project. If you'd prefer to believe it's not an MMO, that's up to you, But personally, I'm pretty convinced that this is Guild Wars 3. We know Guild Wars 2 is slated for another mini expansion this summer, and after that, I wouldn't be surprised if even more developers and resources are once again shifted towards this new game. For now though, we'll likely have to be patient before any concrete details emerge, and for all we know, this game might never see the light of day, even if it is Guild Wars 3. There's a lot of things I really love about Guild Wars 2, the current iteration of this franchise that we have now. But if we're talking about a next generation version that takes the game to new heights, there's a couple key features that I believe are going to be really important for its success. I just praised ArenaNet for its ability to innovate in Guild Wars 2, but it's also important to recognize when older design systems and expectations just work and probably shouldn't be discarded. And MMOs have been around for a heck of a long time now, so there's just certain systems that I think we should revert to and stick with because they're just so proven. One area I'd love to see ArenaNet revisit is the inclusion of a more traditional questing system in a potential Guild Wars 3. Currently, there are a lot of what could be considered traditional MMO-style quest lines tucked away in the Guild Wars 2 achievement panel and collection interface. While these systems offer a lot of content if you know what you're looking for, they can be relatively unintuitive and often just missed by players. And this isn't necessarily the player's fault. The interface just isn't designed to draw attention to these things in the same way that a more traditional questing system might. Reintroducing a traditional exclamation point style questing system could bridge this gap while complementing the dynamic event system that Guild Wars 2 has become known for. I believe the sweet spot for MMO quest design lies in blending the exciting spontaneity of dynamic events that give the impression of a living world, a world with consequences, with a structured and easily discoverable questing experience. This dual approach would allow players to engage with the world in a way that feels both immersive, directed, and hopefully more approachable for new and inexperienced players who need more guidance. I unfortunately know of a lot of players who just couldn't get into the game or quit because of the game's radical approach to leveling. From a story perspective, traditional text-based quests also provide an excellent opportunity to expand the game's lore without relying too heavily on voice acting, which can be both costly and limiting in the types of stories that you can tell. While voice dialogue adds a cinematic and, AAA quality to the main story, not every piece of the narrative needs to be delivered in that format. And it's something that started to drive me crazy in Guild Wars 2. Smaller scale storytelling through written quests, journals, or lore books allows for richer world building and deeper exploration of the game's story and the history of the world. And I know ArenaNet have already made some of these changes in Guild Wars 2, but I think a more complete retooling of these areas would be fantastic in any future iterations of the franchise. And this also doesn't mean there can't be collections and achievements with interesting story tie-ins like we have now. I just think there's a happy medium somewhere between all of these systems. The second area I would really love to see renewed focus, and if you follow my channel, I've mentioned this many times before, is to return focus to competitive game modes, which for me includes PvP, world versus world, and I'm willing to even throw in dungeons and raids. It's no secret to anyone who's been playing Guild Wars 2 for more than 3 or 4 years now that PvP and world versus world have largely been left by the wayside, despite occasional updates or promises of improvements that may or may not ever make it into the live game. And for those unfamiliar with the history, Guild Wars 2 was at one point an incredibly ambitious game on the competitive front at launch. The game had really high hopes for its structured PvP mode to break into the esports scene. In fact, we used to have proper tournaments, including an ESL Pro League, which ran until 2016. If you dig into old interviews, you'll see how much emphasis the developers placed on esports back then, which I guess was understandable because the esports craze was really well underway by then. The reason I believe so strongly in the value of competitive game modes, especially PvP, is that they provide content that is always replayable. Unlike PvE, where players can eventually finish the content, PvP offers an ever-changing experience fueled by the skill and creativity of the player base. Because Guild Wars 2's combat system was so strong, I really do believe structured PvP was a missed opportunity, and I still believe that PvP has a lot of untapped potential, provided it receives the attention, resources, and development it deserves. And I also still firmly believe that World vs. World has endless untapped potential, and to this day, no other game has truly captured the unique vision that ArenaNet originally had for this game mode. And I know it was inspired by some previous PvP game modes and other MMOs from the past, but I would love to see this included in a new iteration. For years, World vs. World was the primary reason I logged into Guild Wars 2 regularly, and it was the main game mode I participated in consistently. And it wasn't just the gameplay itself that made it special, although I think that was really compelling. It was the way that World vs. World fostered interaction, camaraderie, and just general community engagement. Players from the same server had a shared purpose and a tangible reason to work together, which created meaningful bonds and encouraged teamwork on a pretty large scale. The only guilds I was ever actively a part of were all world versus world focused. These guilds thrived on strategy, coordination, the shared excitement of massive battles, and they offered a unique experience that no other game mode in Guild Wars 2 or most other MMOs has been able to replicate. I do have hope for these new modes in a new iteration, and I think it's interesting that Colin Johansson, who left ArenaNet in 2016, around about the time that the Pro League was dropped, went on to work on Crucible, a competitive third-person shooter at Amazon. And while most of us are aware that Crucible failed miserably, I am hoping that Colin and some of the other ex-Crucible devs that have made their way to ArenaNet have some fresh ideas to contribute, and that they still, have a vision for World versus World, because I think it would be a real shame to just not include it. On the dungeons and raids side of things, I feel Guild Wars 2 has really suffered from spreading itself too thin with too many systems. The sheer variety of instance content, from classic dungeons to raids to strike missions, has created a really muddled experience. Right now the game feels super dense and unnecessarily complex, which can be overwhelming for new and returning players alike. Ultimately, Guild Wars 2 has drifted into being an almost exclusively PvE focused game, which works well for, a significant portion of the current player base these days. However, if ArenaNet isn't willing to, fix the competitive game modes, in a new game that is, they might as well turn their next project into a single player RPG for all I care. I really believe competitive content is what gives MMOs longevity and replayability, and I hope that ArenaNet will see the value in revisiting this core aspect of their game. If this project really is Guild Wars 3, there are so many other questions that we could explore, from gameplay, mechanics, art, to narrative direction, but I have a feeling that each of these topics will probably deserve their own dedicated video in order to really do them justice. There's just so much to talk about here. But I'm excited to see how this project unfolds, and I look forward to diving deeper into these discussions, hopefully in the future as more details emerge. In the meantime, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all of this. Was there anything new here that was that you hadn't seen before? What do you think of the potential of Guild Wars 3? Feel free to drop a comment below, and until next time, thanks for watching.